This particular lesson is on what's called the French bias binding. It's a relative to quilt binding, and I find it's a lot more manageable than other kinds of bias binding. Here is our example that we will work through in steps. I use this particular binding in situations where I want a finished edge, but I don't want to sew a facing, putting the right sides together, sewing it, turning it right sides out, where you end up with a lot of different thicknesses. So to begin, we first need to prepare the edges. What you're seeing here, I've put some fusible interfacing on the curves because you don't want the curves to stretch. You could also stay stitch the curves to paper. That's another option. But the object here, do not stretch the curves. Once you have the two layers together that you wish to sew together, the stay stitching that you see in this particular photograph is actually on the finished edge. This will be the outer edge of the finished binding. The stay stitch holds everything in place and it keeps that seam allowance from shifting, and it also secures the two layers together. Now that you've prepared the garment to receive the binding, we want to prepare the binding. The binding is, of course, cut on the true bias. The formula for the width of the binding is the finished width of the binding, in our example 1/2 inch, times 6, so that would make 3 inches total, plus 1/4 of an inch if it's thin fabric, or 3/8 of an inch if it's thicker fabric. So this particular binding is going to be thicker fabric, so this is 6 times 1/2 inch equals 3 inches, plus 3/8 of an inch, for 3 3/8 of an inch. That is the width that we cut the binding strips. Obviously, you cut enough length to get around whatever edges that you need to bind. If you don't have enough length with the strips, you can join strips together, but when you're sewing the strips together, you want to sew on the lengthwise or crosswise grain. So as you see here, the seam will create a 45-degree angle to the cut edges of the fabric because the bias of the fabric represents the cut edge. Pressing the strips is very important. Before you actually start pressing everything in half lengthwise, which is what we're going to be doing, and that's what's being shown in this photo, you want to press the strips flat and give just a tiny bit of pull. This does what's called cracking the bias. If you forget this step, what you're going to get is ripples later on. So you first press flat on the pressing table, cracking the bias, and then in the step shown here, you're going to press the strips in half lengthwise. Now, something to be aware of when you're pressing the strips in half lengthwise, you want to press it dead square. If you shift one edge slightly one way or the other, that will result in ripples later on. When you're pressing these bias strips, you don't want to give a hard crease. You want to bend the fabric, but if you give a hard crease, that's going to cause you problems later. So you see here in this photo, you don't have a hard crease on down the center of that strip. That's what you want. If you want the hard crease, that will come later after you install the strip. Now we come to attaching the bias strip to the garment. Now you have the stay stitch that you've sewn on the garment, and that is at the finished edge. You're going to pin the bias strip, lining the raw edges of the bias strip up with that stay stitch. Now when you're pinning, really be careful so as not to shift the two layers of the binding as you're pinning. If the layers of the binding shift, you're going to get diagonal ripples that are called roping, R-O-P-I-N-G. It's a technical term. So you can see in this photograph, I have lined the raw edges of the bias strip up to the machine stitching. There are three contours of seam that this binding goes over. There are straightaway, I call it. There are what are called outside curves, and then there are called inside curves. In this photo here, you see the bias running along a straightaway and coming up to an outside curve. Now you notice in the pinning on the outside curve, see how the strip angles up slightly? It's roughly about a 45-degree angle. The object here when you're pinning an outside curve is that you ease the bias strip slightly. You don't want it sticking perpendicular to the fabric. You don't want it laying flat against the fabric. It's about a 45-degree angle. So as you're pinning, you're going to push the bias strip backwards a little bit so that the edge of the folded edge is going to sit up a little bit, as you see in the photo. I tend to work in sections. I don't like to pin the entire piece and then go back and baste. I like to pin a section, baste a section, and work my way around the garment. You see here in this photo, I have hand basted the bias strip to the garment, and the basting is about 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge. This is so that if the basting leaves any holes in the bias strip, they'll fall in the seam allowance, you'll never see them. But you can see here from this photograph, see how on the straightaway the bias strip lays flat, but when you go around the outside curve, see how it sits up. That's what you're looking for. When you're basting, as well as pinning, make sure that the two layers of the bias strip do not shift. Don't skip the basting step. Truly, 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 trust me on this. You've seen straightaway and you've seen outside curves so far. The next curve is what's called an inside curve. This is the neck seam. Now this is opposite. On the outside curves, you ease the bias strip slightly. On the inside curve, you stretch it slightly. In this photo here, you see from the inside of the curve, you can see the pins, you can see how the bias strip is rolling over and facing towards the raw edges of the garment. That is as it should be. In this photograph, you can see from the other side. Again, see how the bias strip is curving towards the raw edges, towards the inside curve. What this does is it gives you enough length around the outer perimeter to get around the curve smoothly, but the middle of the strip is going to be shorter, and that way it will sit flat when you press it. As before, I like to thread baste everything in place as I work along. So this is the inside curve basted looking from the front. And then in the next photo, you can see what it looks like from behind. Get your entire binding basted around, and then we'll talk about how to join the ends in a moment. Here we have the two ends of the bias strip that you can see they're left loose. I don't like to join them until later. Give yourself about 6 inches, because that way you can sort of customize where you put that seam, because you're going to have to seam them together. I like to have this seam on the side. I don't like it dead center back, either center back at the neck, center back at the hem. It calls attention to itself. So having it on the side makes it disappear. So now we have the bias strip all basted in place. The next step will be trimming. We trim the seam allowances of the wool down to the stay stitching that we sewed in the first step. Now, since we placed the raw edges of the bias strip on the stay stitching, we will trim everything the wool to the raw edges. Everything lines up. This will be our stitching guide later. Once we've done that, we are ready to machine sew. We have the work on the machine, and I put a piece of painter's tape down at the 1/2 inch just as a stitching guide. That's not absolutely necessary, but I just thought it would read well in the photo and it helps for accuracy. You're going to be sewing at 1/2 inch. That is the finished width. You can see that we began the stitching and ended the stitching, leaving the two ends free. We will finish the ends later, but I like to stitch everything else to get it secured before we press. For the initial pressing, you're going to be pressing the seam allowances towards the bias strip. You can see here I'm using a sleeve board. You can use a pressing ham. Whatever tool you need, you press the seam allowances, all the seam allowances, towards the bias strip. From here, we start turning the binding. We're going to turn the folded edge of the binding back against the inside. When turning, I don't start at one point, work around, and end up at another point in the pinning. I like to scatter the pins to make sure that the fullness on the folded edge of the bias strip distributes. So for example, if you're looking at the neck seam, I pin, say, at the shoulders and at the center back, and then distribute pins around the perimeter. That way you make sure that you don't end up with more bulk in one point and less bulk in another. Once everything's pinned, it's a good idea to thread baste. Don't be skimpy with your thread basting. If you don't thread baste, something could shift and you'll get that dreaded roping. So hand baste as you're pinning, then you don't have to dodge around the pins. Hand basting everything also makes it easy to join the ends of the binding because you don't have to worry about pins. So we go back to where we're going to join the ends, and the first photo you can see I folded back the binding to make a fold, and then in the next photo the opposite end of the binding I've come in and I have folded so that the two folded edges meet. That is where I'm going to put the seam. Now you can decide where to put the seam, anywhere along that particular space that you've created. So you can fine-tune the positioning of that seam. After you have folded those two edges, give it a little bit of a press to mark the fabric. Next, open up the strips and pin along that pressed edge. So you're going to pin the two strips together, matching those folded edges. And in the next photo here, you can see we've sewn the seam, we've trimmed the seam allowance to 1/4 inch, we pressed everything open. And then in this third photo, finally, you press the bias strip wrong sides together, and then you're ready to apply. The final steps here are to sew by machine from one end to the other where you didn't sew the bias binding to the garment. From here, you're going to press and pull the bias binding around to the back and pin and thread baste. Once you've thread basted, you sew with a little slip stitch. You would refer to hand sewing videos for the slip stitch, but the slip stitch, notice the thread goes in just below the machine stitching. The thread will also travel just behind the fold as well. If you sew it that way, when you press everything flat, you're not going to see the stitching in the final finished piece. The final press, I prefer not to use the iron on. I will steam everything and use my my clapper, you don't want to really leave any imprints of the iron on this. I find it gives a better result if you steam it, you put the clapper on, you let it cool. It's going to create a nice finished fold. And then finally, here's our beauty shot. This is what we've created. Something that looks the same from both sides, and that is the object here. Next, a couple of tips to make this more successful. The first tip is what I call adjusting the width of the seam allowance. There are times that, despite your best efforts, when you bring the bias strip up and over, it's going to look as it does in the photo, that you will actually see the machine stitching, which is not something you want. What this tells us is that the seam allowance is just a tiny bit too wide for the bias strip. This is not catastrophic. Your fix on that really is just to shave down the seam allowance. You may have to shave it down a couple millimeters at a time, but you can see here we're trimming it just below the machine stitching. And then finally, the result. It will fit perfectly, and then it will be ready to hand stitch. One tip to make your life easier. The other tip concerns ending a binding at a finished edge. So let's say you have a round neckline on a garment and you don't want to bind it at the opening. Say it has an opening in the back. So you just want the binding around the neck. This photo is the example of what we're going to be achieving. And if you look at the edge coming up on the right, that is a faced edge. You will apply your bias binding as you did before, the only difference being that you have the strip of binding extending past the edge as you see in the photograph. After you've sewn the bias binding up to the edge, what I like to do, and you can see it in this photo with the double-ended arrows, you're going to go back and for the last about 3/4 of an inch, you're going to sew with extremely short stitches, 0.5 millimeter stitches. You want this sewn extremely securely because later you can trim the seam allowances down. So the bias strip sews to the garment in this manner. Next, you fold the bias strip back on itself, right sides together. So what you're looking at here is you're lining up the folded edge of the bias strip with the seam where you sewed the bias strip to the garment. After pinning, take it over to the machine, and it's easier to do this with a zipper foot. You will use the same 0.5 stitch to sew, and you follow the seam allowance. You just stitch ever so slightly outside the edge, even 0.5 millimeter. And it will look like this photo here. You can see the orange stitching is the stitching that we just sewed. Next, you want to press open the seam allowance on this little bias strip that you just sewed. The easiest way is to use your point presser and get a bamboo or wood point presser. That way you don't have to worry about melting it when you're pressing. You're going to prop up that end on the point presser and press it open. After it's pressed open, you clip your corners and trim down your seam allowances. After you've clipped your seam allowances, you will trim the seam allowance of the wool or of the garment at about a 45-degree angle. You can see here. This is why you sewed with the very short stitches. You can trim almost down to the stitching line with the wool. This will remove the bulk, which will help create a flatter end. Finally, you turn everything right side out, and you're ready to slip stitch this closed with a perfect binding on any kind of neck curve.